Welcome and good evening. I'm Martin Hirsch. I'm the student body president and an economics major here at Iowa State, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We'd like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. Iowa State University is located on ancestral lands and territory of the Bakozi or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained the land from the Mezvinsky and the Sioux Nations in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the 17,000 Native people that live in Iowa today. We'd like to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's talk, the History Department, the Political Science Department, the Greeley School of Journalism, the Greeley School First Amendment Committee, Philosophy and Religious Studies Department, University Library, Conference Planning and Management, and Committee on Lectures, which is funded by student government. We encourage all who attend lectures to consider supporting the program through your financial gifts. Please give the Visit tab on the lecture's website or check out the information at the lecture's program table to learn more. A few housekeeping items before we begin. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. Please note there are microphones set up in the front of the room for you to use tonight. Please do not use a flash if you're taking pictures. If you leave before the Q&A is finished, please exit quietly and refrain from talking until you've left the room. A lectures program student worker will be in the foyer to scan your student IDs if you're here for class credit. Card scanning will not start until the lecture is finished. Finally, I'd like to briefly announce an upcoming event. On Tuesday, September 10th, New York University economics professor Simon Gilchrist will give his lecture, Impacts of Transitioning to a Greener Economy. His talk will be at 6 p.m. in the Great Hall of the Memorial Union. Tonight's speakers are Ames native and former Iowa House Representative Ed Mezvinsky, former Chief Counsel of the U.S. House Judiciary Economic and Commercial Law Subcommittee, Jonathan Yarowski, and Vice President for the MacArthur Foundation, Jeff Uboy. Tonight's moderator is Editor-in-Chief of the Iowa Capital Dispatch, Kathy Obravovich. Please give them a warm Iowa State welcome.
Good evening. It was almost 2 years ago, in June 1972, that 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington. It turned out that they were connected with my re-election committee, and the Watergate break-in became a major issue in the campaign. The basic question at issue today is whether the president personally acted improperly in the Watergate matter. There have been allegations, insinuations that I knew about the planning of the Watergate break-in and that I was involved in an extensive plot to cover it up. The House Judiciary Committee is now investigating these charges.
From our perspective and from the committee's role, it was a combination of putting the presidency on trial. We had to decide whether or not, under our Constitution, this one check of the abuse of power, whether this one check that the framers of our Constitution laid out, which they never expected probably to ever happen, whether that check was in play. What we didn't realize, at the same time the presidency was on trial, the Congress was on trial, because the Congress had to make a decision which was momentous, which affected the country.
The stakes were very high. If we wanted to have justice done, we couldn't be seen to be acting in a partisan way. So the effort was very serious and sincere. The House Judiciary Committee went out of its way to act in as much a nonpartisan way as possible, because we did not want any questions to be asked about were we being unfair to Richard Nixon. So we wanted to do whatever we did correctly.
Ever since the existence of the White House taping system was first made known last summer, I have tried vigorously to guard the privacy of the tapes. I've been well aware that my effort to protect the confidentiality of presidential conversations has heightened the sense of mystery about Watergate, and in fact has caused increased suspicions of the president. Many people assume that the tapes must incriminate the president, or that otherwise he wouldn't insist on their privacy.
We had no idea that there would be tapes that we would listen to. And when I heard the tapes and had to make that decision, that's really what was a major factor in terms of ultimately deciding the vote.
Nobody took any pleasure in that vote. I didn't agree with many of the things that Richard Nixon stood for, but I hated having to cast that vote because he was my president, and I did not want to see a president of the United States engage in that conduct. But I knew I had no choice. I knew I had a responsibility under the Constitution to hold him accountable.
When we had to vote, it was very emotional because I didn't want to impeach a president. I didn't want to remove a president. I didn't want to acknowledge the abuse of office.
When we voted for the impeachment of Richard Nixon, I don't recall that any poll had been taken. So nobody exactly knew what the consequences of this were going to be. We just did what the evidence and the Constitution and the law told us was the right thing to do.
And then when Nixon had to he made his resignation speech in the White House, and he talked about it, and I was then driving to the Hill. This was after the hearings and everything. I literally pulled off the road and cried because I felt what it did to our country, but yet on the other hand, it was, as I indicated, Congress on trial. It was the test. And it probably, as I said, came out to perhaps be one of the finest hours.
Breaking news.
The impeachment of the president have its effect on the lives of all Americans for many years to come.
The positive is that hopefully what small part that these papers will have, not just my papers, but the importance of documentation, the importance of keeping the history so that students now and people can have a chance to experience what I experienced, but learn from it. It tells you that in the midst of all this turmoil that we're in right now, we hope that maybe all of this will encourage participation, which will ultimately restore some trust in all of the government. But you hope that ultimately that experience is one to be remembered and to be combined with the past and hope for the future.
Is this on? No? Is it on now? No? Hello, 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 hello. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. What about this one? Hello? No? Yes. Yes. Aha. Okay, here we go. All right. Well, first of all, thank you to Martin for that kind introduction. Now, my name's Kathy Obradovich, and as Martin's told you, I'm the editor-in-chief of Iowa Capital Dispatch. We're a not-for-profit news organization based in Des Moines. We cover state government and politics. And I have, I don't know, something like 37 years of covering Iowa government and politics for other publications like the Des Moines Register and other Iowa newspapers. So, as part of my job over the years, I have come across Congressman Mezvinsky. And actually, probably most of you won't remember this, but several of us were here in 2018 for a similar type of event. How many of you guys were here in 2018? Oh my gosh, more than I thought. So that's terrific. And as you sort of heard in the video, I think, at the time in 2018, Congressman Mezvinsky was donating the bulk of his papers from his time in Congress and his family papers to Iowa State University. Yay! So we're back tonight because not all of the congressman's papers could be donated at that time. Why? Because they were confidential documents related to the Watergate hearings. There were a lot of closed hearings during that time. There were documents that, through an agreement between Congress and President Nixon, could not be released for 50 years. So the clock has been ticking on, and we are now past that 50-year point. And the congressman is donating the rest of his papers to Iowa State, where they will be available for the public, other people, researchers, scholars, to read and look at and learn from. You know, there's been a lot of history under the bridge since we were here 5 or 6 years ago. Back then, we were talking about the Mueller investigation. Does anybody even remember what that was about? It was about Russian interference in the 2016 election. So President Trump had not been impeached once, let alone twice. We did not have the Supreme Court immunity ruling that we have today. The landscape has completely changed since we were here last. So it's going to be really fun to talk about. And we actually need to talk really fast before it all changes again, because that's how fast things are moving. But first, before we start, I really want to encourage anyone who has a question or think you might have a question to be ready when we open up the discussion. As Martin told you, there's 2 microphones on either end of the room. It would be helpful as you think of your question. After we've gone through at least a couple questions with the panelists, I will remind you, but come up here and be ready to ask. We seem to recall last time that it took a little while to get people started, but in fact, there were a lot of questions and they were fantastic. In fact, I think my questions, are probably really brilliant, but I think that the best questions always come from the audience. And as a reporter, I found that when I was covering these things, the most interesting conversation a lot of times comes from the audience questions. So do not be shy. All right, now let's get to the panel. I'm going to keep these introductions fairly short. You guys can embellish as you like. But Edward Mezvinsky represented Iowa's 1st Congressional District in Congress from 1973 to 77. And as you saw in the video, served on the House Judiciary Committee during Watergate. He has also served as U.S. representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And he is currently, is that right, President of Global Advocacy and Patient Advocate for Jericho Road Community Health Center in Buffalo, New York, including medical outreach in Sierra Leone and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He is the son of immigrant parents and born and raised here in Ames, Iowa. So let's give Congressman Mezvinsky. All right. Thank you. Jonathan Urowski, we had to practice that name because we've got a Mezvinsky and a Obradovich, a Urowski, we all stick together, right? and you boys, So, Jonathan is currently a partner and co-chair of public policy and legislative affairs at the law firm WilmerHale. He's also served in a number of government positions. In 1982, he was appointed chief counsel of the House Judiciary, Economic, and Commercial Law Subcommittee. Soon thereafter, he became general counsel of the House Committee on the Judiciary, where he oversaw lawyers in 6 different subcommittees, developing legislative policy ranging from constitutional, civil rights, criminal law, to antitrust and intellectual property. From 1995 to 1998, Urowski served as special counsel to the president, who was at that time Bill Clinton, whom he advised on antitrust, telecommunications, crime, and judicial selections. For the past 3 years, he has been named by the Washingtonian magazine as one of the most influential people shaping policy. So, all right. And Jeff Ubois works with memory and philanthropic institutions and has collaborated with Congressman Mezvinsky on his collection of Watergate and personal papers since 2016 to demonstrate the connection between personal archives to public history. Jeff joined the MacArthur Foundation in 2011. Most recently, he co-founded Lever for Change, a MacArthur affiliate that has directed more than $2.4 billion in charitable donations. Jeff. Okay, so I really want to have a conversation as opposed to me grilling you. But I want to start by giving each of you a chance to spend about 5 minutes just giving us an opening statement. Questions from me might be directed to one of you in specific, but anybody who wants to has a chance to weigh in. So starting with you, Congressman.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank everybody here for coming. This is Iowa State. This is my home. I was raised in Ames. It's a special occasion for me to come home, and I'm proud of the fact that I'm here with you. And I just want to thank you all for being here. It's a tradition that I grew up with, and it really affected my thinking when I had to deal with the issue of impeachment. It came from Ames, Iowa. It came from this background, and it made all the difference in the world. And you know, what people really want is simple. They want an America that's as good as its promise. That's what they want. It's not complicated. They want that to be there. And then, when the people fear their government, it was said, there's tyranny. But when the government fears the people, there's liberty. And that's really what we're dealing with. And when I had to come from my background where we grew up listening to a radio and believing our president, to going through the period that we went through in Watergate, which has the legacy that we're living with today, much different. To show you the differences, Kathy comes from the press. The press in 1974, when we did impeachment, had the support of the public 74%. Today, it's in the 30s. Totally different makeup, different time, but it tells you something about the legacy that we have. The other issue is, and John and Jeff will talk about that, is that we had 8 members of the Republican Party that voted for impeachment because they believed in America, because they believed that this was too important. We had a Supreme Court at that time where 8 members of the Supreme Court decided that the papers that ended up being criminal should be released. So what I've learned from this experience is that times change, that hopefully we will think the good thoughts, and that the traditions that I was raised with and that you have here at Iowa State will carry on, even in the midst of a period of time that's very frustrating. And the last point is that, look, this is an election year, And so hopefully we learn from the past and try to take advantage, as we said, when the government fears the people, there will be liberty.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Well, I'm not from Iowa, but my parents were, so that's what I'm going to reach for here tonight. But it's good to see you all. You know, in many ways, for me, the images, and that was a great brief film that I had, and I was somewhat the age of many in here, a little younger perhaps, but what lasted for me was seeing Ed at the far end of the dais in this big room called the House Judiciary Committee. And also then the final capper was, there was Richard Nixon, after he gave his final speech to resign, waving with two arms of victory, flashing a victory sign, and then jumping into a helicopter and flying away. And it was a pretty powerful set of images that, whatever age you were, but certainly my age, that I never, it's indelible. I mean, we've had so many, you know, startling images that have run over various screens that we all look at, but that one was searing. And so I guess my hope tonight is more back to the future, because there's a lot back there, and it's not just pining for the past, that we need to remember about and then try to reshape this in the future. The two things that have really changed most for me, Kathy, and there's so many, is one, the political atmosphere, and Ed mentioned that. And I have lived in that political atmosphere in Washington for a long time. And the second really is the nature of the national conversation. What I mean by that is there was really a national conversation going on about major things. It wasn't just because we only had 3 networks, but citizens would get involved on major issues, and this was one of them. And now, really, there is a national conversation, but it's very diffuse, and I'm not criticizing it. It's just a different feel to it, but it also may have led to some real form of alienation that we all feel, a little more isolated, a little more alienated, and not part of a larger common goal. So to me, that sounds a little cultural, but I think that's part of it. Quickly, I guess impeachment has always stalked me since I became a lawyer. It really has. Watching that was the seminal moment, but then I actually, on the House Judiciary Committee, the same committee Ed served on, dealt with 3 judicial impeachments in the 1980s. People forget that judges were impeached recently. You know, that impeachment with Nixon was a full 100 years after the prior impeachment, which was Andrew Johnson, and then everything quickened. 3 judges were, impeached, and then we had a presidential impeachment in the 90s, and then, of course, in recent times, we've had 2 impeachments. And, believe it or not, 9 weeks ago, an impeachment resolution passed the House Judiciary Committee, same committee, I guess that's the locus of control, against our current president, President Biden. I don't think it will even have a vote on the floor, but it's just to show you, impeachment has become the currency of the realm. If anything, for me, the last image I have, before I turn this over to Jeff, is really, Watergate for me now is more of a bittersweet memory. Why would I even say that? I mean, it's a bitter memory because of a dastardly executive conduct that we saw. But the sweetness of it was that the system really worked. And people left party behind, let it fall down from their shoulders, and really honored their, oath of office. And that's a good memory. So I live with this hybrid sense of Watergate. And I don't live with the hybrid sense of Jeff, who's a wonderful person, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Those are great, solid personal testimonials and a hard act to follow. I had 3 things that came to mind thinking about this panel, about the connection between archives and the public record. And the first one is that archives are really having a moment now. If there's a sense of alienation and a sense of being awash in the fake and a sense of being surrounded or filled or flooded with disinformation of some kind, there's also a kind of hope that archives provide some authentic kind of ground truth or some set of agreed upon facts or some record in which people are talking to themselves and therefore not presenting things for public consumption or being less forthcoming in some way that you can get out of a set of personal papers like those that Ed has. So that's the first thing that came to mind for me. The second thing that's interesting, and Ed's papers are an example of this, is the shift from print to digital as the primary way of remembering what's happened. I think, Ed, if all of your documents from 1974 had been on computer tape, it might be hard for us to read them now. And so that ability of your records to survive some decades of being sealed up, of benign neglect, is something that is not typically true of things that are digital. So the digital record is in some ways more extensive, it's more fine-grained, it's more comprehensive, but it's also a lot more fragile. And so that is one aspect of the shift from print to digital that I think we still don't understand. On the other hand, digitization opens up all kinds of possibilities for access. Driving here, we passed by 2 presidential sites, one for Herbert Hoover and one for Ronald Reagan. And they were closed at the hour we drove by, and I don't know how many people they could have accommodated, but Ed's papers are now accessible to about 5 billion people 24 hours a day. So that's really a change for social understanding and the kind of awareness that can result from the sharing of personal papers in a digital way. And that brings me to my last general point, which is that the cultural moment and the technology shift and the cultural shift are really changing the roles and responsibilities and possibilities for both the institutions that accept paper collections like this and the individuals that contribute them. I think for the institutions, it's always a question of resources. There's a lot, we all produce a lot more than any single library or set of libraries is going to collect. But that makes it heartening when an institution decides to do something that's really innovative and forward-looking and responsible and cool, which I think Iowa State University libraries have done with this project. And that brings me to the last kind of subpoint around the individual donor. So I think all of us at this point are carrying around little movie cameras. We're probably all custodians of some digital material that would be of use to people in the future. I think it takes actually, Instagram influencers aside, it takes a lot of guts to make your life open and transparent to public view with a collection in the way that Ed has done. I think that we're still not really all the way through a set of cultural norms about that. But one of the documents in Ed's collection is called Let's Not Escape into Silence. It's on universal standards for human rights. It's hopeful, but it's also a pretty good theme for this issue of personal collections and personal papers.
Wonderful. I'm going to stand to ask my questions because I know some of you on the edge can't really necessarily see around the lectern here. So the question that was asked by the title of this panel is, what have we learned? 50 years from Watergate, what have we learned? So I'm going to break that question down. We heard a little bit from Congressman Mezvinsky about what he has learned, but I'm going to ask you, starting with you, but everybody can weigh in, what have we learned about the impeachment process as a means to hold a president accountable? I think that answer probably has changed over the years. Go ahead.
Well, what have we learned from the impeachment process? The impeachment process, when we did it, there was only one other impeachment. It was over 100 years ago. Now, it seems to be the modus operandi to show your displeasure with the president. As pointed out, you got the present president that there was a motion to do that. But impeachment is more than just removing a president. As John said, it's also a judge, but it's more a process, it's the legacy. What does it mean? Is our government really working together? Do both sides, would the environment today, which we all see now because the environment's different. There we got our reports from a machine, or we had the regular media. And what do we have now? We have social media, which has a tremendous impact on this whole process. And it affects thinking, not just of one party, but of all parties. And it's made a significant difference in the attitude. So when you look at Congress today, which I went to, we got along with one another. Whether we were a Democrat or Republican, I got along with the other side. We may have differed, but we still were able to communicate. And the environment has changed significantly. And like it was said, which I quoted Thomas Jefferson, what was said is that when people lose sight of their government, they tend to forget what the outcome may be. And unfortunately today the environment has changed, the press has changed, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to come back to what made Richard Nixon walk away. The reason he walked away is that members of his own party, one in particular, he happened to be a very arch conservative, his name was Barry Goldwater. And another one was the chairman of the Senate committee. His name was Hugh Scott. And the third was a House member. They went to him and said, look, it's over. The ball game's over, Mr. President. You're going to be convicted. You'll be the only one convicted. Johnson, the first one, wasn't convicted. And he stepped aside. And really, my last thought on that is this. We're living in an unusual period now, and I learned this growing up in Ames. I learned this about respecting those that care for you, learning from those that you respect and understand and listening to them. And I think that's one of the lessons that maybe public life has to show, is that whether you're on one side or the other, your ears and your antennas are up, and you consider what is best for our country. And that's part of the lesson that I got in the past and probably what we're living with today.
I don't know if either of you want to weigh in on that, but I am curious about whether you think impeachment can hold a president accountable anymore. But feel free to weigh in just generally on the question.
Well, I think Ed began to hint at that at the very end, is that impeachment has to mean something in the constitutional scheme and to the people. And why I say the constitutional scheme is what I've witnessed anyway. Let me make it more subjective then, let others make their own judgment. What I've really witnessed is the evisceration of congressional power. I mean, in our system. And impeachment was really the last vestige of that letting go. The 20 years of polarization, it's not just the incivility that we all hate, okay, wherever you sit. I mean, that's what they think, we often think polarization is. It is really a destructive force on our constitutional structure, because the whole point of a separation of powers, of checks and balances, was to make sure you had three strong branches that would guard against the encroachment of power by either the king, no longer a king, or any group. And that's what the lesson was in our Constitution. And Congress came first. They were Article 1 in the Constitution. That's what the framers were really thinking about to launch this ship. Well, it kind of went on that way for a long time, but in the last 20 years, you've seen the incivility, you've seen the polarization, and now Congress can't pass legislation They have to wait to the end of a 2-year Congress to put it on a 3,000-page bill. They can't pass a standalone bill. It's really sad. So there goes that power. That the executive has jumped in then and started doing a lot of rulemaking and executive orders, but that should be often done by legislation. Impeachment stood alone, though. It had not been used. And so that was still kind of this, incumbent power that was there. And now, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen impeachment has become a political move, a maneuver, not kind of the last resort that Ed has described. That has done real, in my view, real destruction. Not just bad emotional response to something, real destruction. Now, can it come back and we can talk about that? I think it can, and probably there are a lot of green shoots of growth that can occur in this room, and we can talk about that maybe a little later.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to weigh in, or do you want a new question? Okay, I'm going to give you a new question then, because I think you alluded to this in your opening remarks about the stability of digital recordings or digital records. And of course, one interesting thing about the Watergate hearings, of course, is that the pivotal records weren't paper, they were audio, right? And furthermore, there were 18 minutes missing from that audio recording. And you can delve into that if you want to, but my question is, now, first of all, I wonder whether people are going to trust records regardless of what format they're in. And are we entering into a territory where digital records, which may have seemed, more trustworthy to some as, multimedia, video, et cetera, that we're now entering into an era of AI where maybe even that may not be reliable. So how does that affect a guy in your kind of job?
That's a great question. I think there's a word called provenance, which is where did you get this from, would be a simple translation. And that question of provenance for digital records is weighs heavily on everybody who is in the field. I think you didn't say the word deep fakes, but that's I think what you were alluding to, that ability
we had deep
to generate.
throat, and now we've got deep fake. Right?
Yeah, to generate any image, and would you believe it or could you believe it? I mean, the history of faking images is pretty long-standing. That's what is the name of the Commissar Vanishes? It's a history of Soviet political photographs and how they were edited over time to remove people who shouldn't have been standing next to Stalin. So there's one line of thinking that is among the technological optimists that say, look, we'll be able to digitally sign and prove the authenticity of digital works down through time. So that's one line of thinking about that question. Another is that you will see more reliance on trustworthy institutions or people that are in some position to certify what's been done. I think there's a kind of a flip question related to that, which is that you can have something that is completely true and absolutely authentic and have it next to something else that's completely true and absolutely authentic and build all kinds of ridiculous connections between those two things. So it's the context that's surrounding the real stuff, like even in your collection, Ed, I can imagine that someone will find some bizarre contextual backdrop for it in order to show the moon landing didn't happen or whatever it is. I don't know that that's much of an answer.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Ed about if there are any bombshells about aliens or the moon landing in his records. But before we leave Jeff here for a second, one of the crazy things that has happened in the past couple of years is that the President of the United States has been charged with a crime for not turning over his records as required by law. And the Supreme Court basically came along with an immunity ruling, and that criminal case has now been dropped. So my question to the panel is, why would any president ever turn over any records further, going forward?
I'm going to bounce this back to these two guys, but I do have a comment on that, which is that we don't really have very good intuitions about digital ownership writ large, right? We have all these metaphors about ownership that are based on physical property, and digital is not entirely like physical property. If I make a copy of something, I have it, you can have it too. It's not like an individual sheet of paper that I'm handing you where there's only one instance of it. And as a result of that kind of confusion, I think people don't have a good intuitive sense of what is a personal possession. Hey, it's on my device, it's on my laptop, maybe I paid for it, and an institutional possession or an institutional record. And that lack of an easy, intuitive, agreed-on boundary between the personal and the governmental, I think, is going to be with us for a long time. People are going to want to save things because they think it's exculpatory. Nixon had a taping system in the Oval Office because he thought it would prove what a great guy he was. So we don't know what's exculpatory and what's damning, and that's another bit of confusion that I think will be with us for a while. But I would really defer to
yeah. Anybody want to
John.
place any bets about whether future presidents are going to turn over the records?
I don't know if they'll turn over the records.
Use your mic.
But even if they don't turn over the records and a proceeding goes forward, I think that decision you just mentioned has turned everything on its head, because, you know, how it works, as you know, the House, you know, starts the hearings if there's going to be a resolution of impeachment, and then eventually, if it gets out of the committee, the Judiciary Committee, Ed's committee, it goes to a House vote. If it passes by even a majority, a simple majority, it goes to the Senate for a trial. And what happens then is, if the Senate by majority votes for conviction, it should be over, but there's always a right of appeal. Now, in the judicial impeachments that I dealt with, there were a couple convictions. The judges did appeal, but what happened was the court didn't take the appeal. They said, look, this is what they called a political question, and the Congress can decide itself what its rules are for impeachment. This isn't a legal issue. That was then. With this decision, and it just happened, so we'll have to see what happens, but with this decision, I can't think of anyone, certainly with those judges, but anyone who might be impeached that would decide just to accept that. He or she would definitely be advised to appeal, because it could go all the way up and the court would say, well, that's an official act. That president was immune. So I really believe now that impeachment won't have a lot of finality, though I do think Congress will still do it for political reasons.
What do you think, Ed?
Well, I think in terms of, you saw the tape, in terms of Richard Nixon, I think his sense of timing wasn't very good. I think if he would have timed his presidency at the same time that the Supreme Court just ruled, I think our committee, I don't think there would have been impeachment. I don't think you would have had resignation. So he didn't have good luck. He picked the wrong time in terms of the present state of affairs. And then as far as the electronic media, you may have just seen that there was an arrest from Russians. Did you notice this last week? The Attorney General just brought action where they were using their, what we call the special electronic media, to impose their view in terms of the election. So we're in a different period now. We're in a different period. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, you had 8 Supreme Court judges, unanimous, rule in 1974. But in terms of 2024, you had the judges go totally in the other direction, and we're living in a different period. And as John points out, and Jeff, the period has changed, and all of us in this room will have to live with a different way of life. And let me just leave it with one thought that just came to mind. When I was campaigning, there was a governor from the state. His name was Harold Hughes. Very well known, and he was very close with one of the counselors to the president. His name was Chuck Colson. And I came into a meeting, and I came in, and it was the same time that a special prosecutor was fired. It was Archibald Cox. And I walked into the room with the governor, who then became a senator, and what did he tell me? He said, Ed, be careful. You may have tanks on your yard. You may have someone go crazy on you. And I looked at him and I said, what are you talking about, Governor? He says, I happen to know the man. So we're living in a different period, and I think these questions, and those of you in the audience from here, can clearly recognize that this period is not the same as 1974. And John and Jeff have sort of reinforced that.
Yeah, yes, for sure. So I want, first of all, to put a call out now. If you have questions, please come to the microphones. Get up, Laura, come on. And be ready to ask. I'm going to ask another question of the panel while you guys are all coming up, but we definitely are looking forward to hearing your questions, and we want to save plenty of time for that. And the more people I see standing up, the more time we will leave for you guys to ask. So, but before you do, I want to, a couple of you have mentioned the role of the media in Watergate. Of course, anybody who has seen the classic movie, All the President's Men, know a lot about how the media were really largely responsible for bringing this before the American people and essentially to the attention of Congress. I mean, without the Washington Post, I don't think there would have been any impeachment proceedings. You can contradict me if you want to, but we don't have the same media today. So. Do you want to start, and maybe we'll just go down the line if there's
the press?
Yeah, about the press.
Well, the impact of the press was phenomenal. I mean, we all listened. You know, you got your information in those days from the press would do a story, and then there was the machines that would come into the congressional office to show you how things have changed. We have the electronic media. So the press made all the difference in the world. Of course, you had Woodward and Bernstein and the breaking of that issue. We had press that back in our district, there was a publisher. There was a Pulitzer Prize winning publisher. His name was John McCorm Lay. The press was the Burlington Press. And he fed our office information. And I just turned into the library. He covered the Watergate like nobody else, but it made a tremendous impact. And it made an impact on not just the Democrats on the committee, but it made an impact on the Republicans on the committee. And just let me leave you the impact of what it did. One member was an FBI agent, Republican. His name, because it's a familiar name that's running right now, his name was Larry Hogan. Larry Hogan was the first Republican that came out for impeachment. But he did it because he was influenced a lot by the press. And to show you how things have changed, he was the father of the president. He's just served as governor of Maryland. He's running for senator now. And he's running as a Republican, but he's not going to endorse his own candidate running for president. So it tells you the impact of the press. The press was strong, but it's much different now because we have the electronic media, and that's made all the difference in the world.
And Jonathan, bring us up to the Bill Clinton impeachment and talk about the role of the press there, and then if you have some general comments, that would be great too.
Well, you know, that was probably during a transition period. It was kind of before social media. Think about it. I mean, the internet was there with engineers, but it really wasn't all around. And in fact, during that impeachment, when people sought documents, Jeff, they sought emails. Emails were finally beginning to happen, and I think we all had the naive view that if you deleted an email, it would disappear forever, and of course it was on all the servers, and we've all learned that now. But, not that we did anything wrong, but then, so there was a transition. But there was also the beginning of some polarization. Okay, the contract with America had occurred, and that was kind of, to me, when things crossed the Rubicon. It really, we had a divided nation that hasn't really healed itself even now. But the papers and the broadcast companies still had a lot of sway on perceptions. Social media hadn't occurred. And eventually, I think the media, at that point in time, try to develop a rounder picture of the situation, so people weighed, kind of the issues that were involved and whether that rose to the level of impeachment and conviction. And I think in the end, even the individual citizen, most of them balanced things out to decide whether that was proper. That's certainly a different weighing process that occurred in the last two impeachments. But with the diffusion of so many different platforms, with so many different commentators, we could say that's great. And it is in one level, it's diverse, and you get, a plethora of views. But on the other hand, psychologically, and I keep coming back to this because we need good citizens who feel good about their lives and their country. Psychologically, the current state of media, which is multi-focused and multi-branched, can be very confusing. And I think we'll never reach, at this moment for a while, a singular view about whether something was right or wrong. And that is a disturbing cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, we talked about the lack of a common set of facts in which to make public decisions. And because we're now viewing so many things through this media kaleidoscope, that common set of facts is difficult. And to Jeff, I really, go ahead and weigh in as you want, but I wonder, because most people are going to view these documents essentially through the media or someone who goes and reads them all and writes about it. They're not all going to be over at the library looking them up themselves. So well, maybe they will. You guys, let's all go to the library after this. But how does that distrust of the media then, carry over to how people feel about these documents and the preservation of them?
Well, two things come to mind. I mean, this is really, we could have a 5-week seminar on this topic, I think, and I'd be excited to do it. One is that the possibility of citation of primary sources is new. To make it that easy to really click and go to the line. Well, I mean, you used to be able to go to a line in a book. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that after the decision yesterday about fair use in digitized books. But up until recently, if you wanted to check a reference that was in a book, you could do it. Being able to check a reference about a Watergate interaction is certainly very promising, that you can trace an idea or a claim or an assertion back to a source is very appealing and I think very hopeful. I think two things are less hopeful. One is that it also means that you can really construct your own story about whatever happened. I kind of mentioned that before. And the third is the economics of it. So personal papers, on the one hand, people see them as increasingly of economic value. We'll feed them to AIs to train them, and they're in some cases rare materials, and so there's a market for them. But really, I think that both the press and archives suffer when they only exist in a market-driven environment, that people who work hard to tell the truth often do it for free. If you think about markets as being exchanges, it's very difficult for you, Ed, to exchange your papers with someone living 100 years from now who might find them of real value. So that market mechanism doesn't work too well either for memory or for media. And I don't think we found sufficient money in philanthropy to cover the gap.
I have a lot more questions, but I want to go to the audience now. We'll start over here. Please say your name, ask your question. We don't have time for everybody to give a speech, so keep your questions succinct so that everybody has a chance to ask. Go ahead, Laura.
I'm Laura Bellin. I have a couple of questions first for Jeff. Can you tell us a little bit about the process? What's involved with going through sealed papers and helping to catalog and organizing them? Do you need security clearance? I'm just wondering how that all works. And for Congressman Mezvinsky, I was just wondering if there was anything, as you went through these Watergate papers, was there something that really surprised you that you didn't remember, anything that really stood out?
So I did not go through the papers that are here. I was not the person who cataloged, I was not the person who did appraisal of the papers here. Generally, that look is partly up to the person who possesses them and the person or the institution to which the donation is being made. As for memories jogged?
Yeah, the question was, I surprised. One of the areas that I recalled was the special prosecutor. You know, you talk about papers. The court in Florida just ruled that the special prosecutor is not constitutional. So here we have special prosecutors from 1974 to 2024. They've been operating in a whole range of areas, and now a judge ruled that a special prosecutor has to be appointed by the U.S. Senate in this case. So that really surprised me. That sort of carried it to the other extreme. But it tells you, in a bottom line, what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a different environment, Laura, and I think that's the difference today to what it was 50 years ago. Little did I know that I'd be sitting on the stage here at Iowa State 50 years later talking about some of the issues we're talking about today. But I'm thankful that I can be on the stage.
All right, question from this side of the room.
Yeah. Hi, and you all three talked about gridlock in Congress around polarization and about the lack of partisanship that exists today. And I think that it's given rise to a real suspicion around government and an even dislike of government and a feeling that politicians are all in it for themselves. I think that it takes two to be bipartisan. And I actually served in the same House seat that you served in when you were in the Iowa General Assembly.
Oh my
And
God.
I'm a Democrat, and I worked with people that I disagreed with, but certainly respected and worked with, like Bob Ray and Jim Leach and a variety of others. And I think that even related to the younger Chuck Grassley. But what I see now is that the people who are Republicans, and many in the voting public who consider themselves still moderate Republicans or whatever, are not having any representation in Congress, or the Hogans are so few and far between as to be pretty much inconsequential. How do we get to something where we either have bipartisanship in passing legislation and getting our country righted, and as in Watergate we had in terms of that, or else we really make clear to the American public that, you know, if you want bipartisanship, you have to have both parties structured in a way that will foster that, and not have it be really not being accepted by the MAGA Republican Party that's taken over that wing.
You know, I would jump in and say there's two things maybe to give you some hope, not false hope, but hopefully some hope. And what you related about your experience is, you know, instructive to all of us and reminded all of us that it's possible. One, and just think back, you'll hear it in the election. Again, I, on this stage, do not want to be partisan in any way, if I can avoid that, because that doesn't really help a discussion. But what you have seen over the last 2 to 4 years has, only in the Senate though, it's not really occurred in the House, because the House is more starkly divided. It just clearly is. But in the Senate, you've seen people, senators, kind of walking around the floor. You know, that when they vote, but most of the time, if they're not in the office, they're just on the floor talking to other senators, right? And it's really a good thing. It's like, goes back 225 years. That's what they did. Well, what we have seen, sir, and you saw it with the immigration bill. Again, I'm going to stay away from that as a campaign issue, but what we saw was, and it's all been covered, was a bipartisan agreement, at least among that group of people that no one thought could ever solve a problem like immigration. It didn't get a vote. We can talk about that in a different forum, but the truth is it's very encouraging. And the same thing happened with the so-called IRA bill, you know, which is going to help hopefully create more green energy and other kinds of projects. That's all kind of just grassroots democracy. At least in the Senate, there's vestiges of it. And when you see 10 or 12 people come together like that, it's really encouraging. The other thing that I'm seeing, and it is that if you really survey the primary races, what you're seeing in both parties, not across the board, but in select races, is that the more extreme candidate, let's say in the primary race in the same party, is not winning all the time. Whether it's Republican or Democrat, not favoring one another. And really what we're beginning to see is a more drift, in a good way, to centrism. Centrism, whatever you want to call it, allows you to listen a little better, right? Because if you don't listen and don't have such a stark ideological view about every issue, you might come up with a solution that will move things forward. So those are two things that I see. It's not going to solve the problem in 2 years, but I do think we're not without hope here.
Anybody else want to add? Okay, question over here. And please just a reminder, say your name, ask your question. We don't have time for speeches. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Susan Zawacki, and my question is sort of a hypothetical one.
Hold the mic down a little bit, Susan.
What?
Hold the mic down just a little bit more.
Oh, okay.
There you
go. My name is Susan Zawacki, and my question is a hypothetical concerning the recent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity. In the weeks following the November election, should some sort of insurrection occur, our current president, Mr. Biden, as I understand it, would be empowered to do whatever he feels is necessary as an official act to maintain order. I wonder if you'd comment on what you think it's possible he might do and what the consequences might be.
Okay, hypothetical on
Would you repeat the question again?
the possibility of another January 6th style insurrection after the 2024 election. The sitting president is Joe Biden. The question is, you know, if this ruling holds up the way people think, that maybe the president could do whatever he wants to quell an insurrection. And what are the limits of that, or what might he do? Anybody want to use your microphone?
It is a hypothetical. The decision hanging out there like a big piñata is a real problem. Now, I think we're going to see quickly lower courts beginning to, have some appeals about the various cases that are pending now. In fact, there was a hearing today in Washington where the judge ruled that immunity needs to be dealt with first because it was interposed. So what I think you're going to have, because it was such a broad ruling by the Supreme Court, that was what the disturbing element is to a lot of good lawyers. Forget the political aspect. To a lot of good lawyers, you normally try to decide things on the narrowest basis, right? On a constitutional basis and not sweep large. This really swept large. And so I think because there's all these appeals going on in these various cases that will bring up presidential immunity, I think we're going to start seeing some interim decisions that will begin to send signals out that maybe it's not as broad as it sounds, But ultimately, it will lap up on the shores of the Supreme Court, and who's ever sitting there will have to make those decisions. So it's a scary hypothetical, but hopefully we'll navigate it.
All right. And over here, your question. And please tell us your name.
My name is Douglas Finnemore. Power. To exercise power, the president needs a team of people. He needs police. He needs the army. Given the president's Supreme Court immunity decision, how far can the pardoning extend this power?
How far the pardoning? So how far can the president go? He can go.
How far can a president go to pardon?
Yeah, I think he can go pretty far now, right?
Yeah, first, John,
there's a question about whether a president can pardon himself.
The president can pardon. He has the pardon authority. I mean, he can pardon. We know, we've seen it. We've seen the pardon carry across the board. So it can be, in terms of checking the pardon power of a president, I don't think we have the kind of checks and balances that John is talking about in the Senate.
Yeah, Ed, you're so right. You know what the framers called the pardon power, with some regret, but they did it? The last vestige of the king. It is the last vestige of the king where there was no, what you just said, checks or balance. There's no appeal on pardons. Presidents that are very careful, and I'm happy I worked for one, went through the Department of Justice. There's actually a pardon office. They make recommendations. You don't have to follow those. But it is just a broad, unfettered power. So the immunity decision won't affect that, but it almost makes presidential, quote-unquote, official actions almost like another vestige of the king, and that's the scary part.
It kind of makes a moot question whether the president can pardon himself, because if he has immunity or she has immunity, they may never need to pardon themselves because they can't get convicted.
The framers were never so clever as you, Kathy, to have thought of that possibility.
Yes.
They're clever, but not that clever.
Yeah. Well, I didn't think of the question of whether the president can pardon himself. Someone else thought of that one. Over here, please tell us your name.
Hello, I'm William Van Hall. My growing concern is that we have created with this presidential immunity Supreme Court case, that we have created a throne for a Caesar, and it merely needs to sit there until someone simply possesses the will to seize it. What would prevent perhaps President number 50 or President number 60 from simply executing political opponents as an official act? There would be no legal recourse for anyone to stop it. What do we do to prevent that decay of morality? How do we stop a president from simply developing the will to seize the throne and keep it in perpetuity?
So essentially ending the peaceful transfer of power because there's no legal repercussions under the immunity for a president who wants to stay in office despite, maybe suspend elections, for example. What are the possibilities there?
It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. That's a question that you raise that is a theoretical question, but in a practical sense, I just haven't crossed the bridge to that to reach that state. I mean, let's hope we don't have to face that kind of a question, but you've raised a theoretical question that you're not alone. But a practical sense, I just have trouble crossing that bridge. That's for me personally.
I agree, Ed. You know, the only sucre I can maybe think of about this, but I agree with you, Ed, is in other parts of the Constitution, they talk about the official transfer of power. That was the whole issue about the vice president certifying the vote, the electors. There's a whole large treatment which basically is about the transfer of power after the requisite number of years in a term or whatever is served. So the hope would be, I guess, that people would argue that it's not an official act. But you know what, not an official act, and so beyond the decision, what really worries me, if you think of more national security intelligence issues, is if there was an assassination a political assassination that was deemed in the national security interest of our country. And you could say Osama bin Laden. We could go through a lot of things. And the president is the final arbiter of that, right? Before, let's say, bin Laden, the final decision was the president in the Situation Room, right? That's who made the decision. I think the argument would be that was an official act because it was pursuant of national security and to protect America. So, as you can see, this immunity decision, maybe that's not so controversial because we all kind of nod our heads, but as you get further and further away from that, it's scary.
Yeah, it's all in the definition of what's an official act, and of course, Special Counsel Jeff Smith is has now reissued his indictment dealing with the January 6th activities to try to redefine that under the special immunity, under the immunity ruling. So we'll see what happens with that. Question over here, and please tell us your name.
My name is Adrian. So you mentioned when you hear that Nixon was impeached, pulling over and crying, And reading about Watergate for me personally and Nixon, I'm just kind of like, man, what's going to happen when people find out about this? But I personally, I'm not shocked, and I just kind of shake my head. So what do you see of the consequences of that mindset where people aren't shocked and they just kind of shake their head?
Yeah, so the question of impeachment, people aren't shocked anymore when they hear, that essentially it may not be the kind of the shame and the end of a political career anymore, as we're seeing. And I think we're already there, frankly, but let's hear what you guys have to say.
Well, when we did it, we viewed it as very serious. We didn't want to remove the president. It was viewed as unprecedented. It was quite a step. First of all, it took a while for us to even move into, to even hold a hearing. We had to have a Senate have a special committee. It was called the Irvin Committee, where we had to really look into it. And then, of course, you had the tapes. I mean, I don't think any more presidents are going to be taping their conversations in the White House. I don't think that'll be a repeat performance. So the climate is different now. The climate is so different, but in view of the environment that we're in, I guess that raises the question that why you raised the question. But it's hard for me to imagine having experienced this where we took it so seriously. We took our time. We went through all kinds of hearings. We tried to convince both sides. We tried to make it bipartisan. We knew that was critical. So the environment was different. The timing was different. The attitude of the press was different. And it tells you the road that we have to take to move into a positive direction. And I just want to say that those of you here that have stayed for this hour and 15 minutes or so, it's amazing. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad the question came up, but let's hope that this impeachment process does not become a habit every term, at least 1, 2, 3 times each session. That it loses the significance of why the founders put impeachment in the Constitution in the first place. And also, it tells me from the experience that I had how we looked at the other side. I got along with my Republicans. I played, we played ball in the gym together. We did a whole host of other things together. We tried to treat each other as human beings. That climate has changed, and hopefully, maybe in time, and the makeup of what happens in succeeding elections may have a major bearing on that question.
Okay. Do you have a follow-up? Okay. Over here, and please say your name.
Oh. We kept it on.
My name's Michael Coyle. My question is, we've brought up how in recent times impeachment has been used as a weapon of politics. But back during Watergate, it was used as a last resort. Do you view there is any way to remove ourselves from impeachment being used as a political weapon now and back to that last resort that it was during Watergate?
So how do we roll back from impeachment being used as a political weapon and back to making it essentially the last resort to hold a president accountable? And I hope I hear from all of you, but I also want to hear, because Ed, I remember you telling us before, the idea of impeaching the president was not popular with your constituents.
No.
Right? So go ahead, Jonathan, if you want to start.
Well, it'd be great to start tonight if there was a parade of people coming to these microphones and announcing they're going to run for office on the platform of upholding the Constitution. Because if we get more people, seriously, that sounds funny, but it's not. We really need an injection of some idealism, but people who really believe in the Constitution. And it's kind of a set piece right now. I think this election, though, if you really study a little bit what seats are up, and really, I think there's going to be real transformational change. I really do. If you look at the candidacies across the country in a variety of places, that's how you can begin to stop this being just a payback device, which is a political device. I mean, we have this now with judges. You might have remembered the nuclear option where, the filibuster rule says you need 60 votes to get past, to move forward to vote on a judge, let's say. And there was so much frustration that people were holding up voting on judges that they, in certain situations, lower court judges, they lowered the number to 51, and then that was a payback for what the other party did. Now impeachment looks to me like a bit of a payback, okay? Especially with this last one, where Joe Biden was just, the resolution was just voted, 8 or 9 weeks ago to impeach him when people knew he wasn't even going to run, right? So this is really the height of that, but what I'm saying is you've got a good court nucleus of Republicans and Democrats who don't like what's going on, but we really need to add to the numbers by some new figures coming in. That incremental, that takes time, so there's no sudden transformation. But again, I'm not hopefully falsely Midwestern in being optimistic even now. I do believe that will begin to happen.
Okay, and Ed, do you want to tell us really quickly the story about how your constituents viewed impeachment of the president when you would come back to Iowa?
It took a long time. When I would come back, people wouldn't talk about impeachment. They were concerned about their life, their survival, what was important just to raise their family and have a job and pay a pension. And so it didn't come up. When I campaigned, we threw, to show you how the difference was, my kids are here, they threw, when we campaigned, people wouldn't talk impeachment. We didn't talk about that. We threw suckers out. We threw little lollipops to try to influence the turnout. People were concerned about economic well-being. And it didn't move. The needle didn't move until toward the end. The tapes, the resolution, it became a multiplier effect. And Iowans, maybe that was a characteristic of the country, but it took a long time, Kathy.
Okay. A question from you.
Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm George McShimsey. I'm a Ames High grad, year ahead of Ed.
Sure.
So he and I grew up with the same set of values. And I think we have reached the point where we've weakened our centers of authority to the point where we're ready for an inflection in the direction of one way or the other. And we know what the one way is because we have Project 2025 set up to take over this country in a right-wing direction and to snuff out what Ed has correctly called as the promise of America. And the promise of America, I would suggest, is the Declaration of Independence, which says that we all have a right to equal rights, and that the history that we ought to consult are the amendments to the Constitution of the United States, which all point to adding the Declaration of Independence to our constitutional structure. Sorry for the speech.
I mean, we don't have time for any more speeches. If you have a question, though, let's hear it.
The question is, how do we get from here to there?
Oh, what? I didn't hear it.
Okay, well, so I don't know if I can summarize that.
It's an important statement. It was important statement.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody here has the answer, but we know that Jonathan is optimistic about how we get back to a place where there's bipartisanship, et cetera. So, okay. Over here, we are running short on time, so tell us your name and ask a question.
Hello, my name's Libby, and it's been mentioned that mainstream media played a big part in Watergate and, in fact, affecting people's opinion on the impeachment. Do you think mainstream media has more or less influence now than it did 50 years ago?
Does mainstream media have more or less influence than it did 50 years ago? Anybody want to say more?
Well, I would duck the question by saying define mainstream media, because sometimes mainstream media is just what everybody sees on their phone. To give you a more serious answer, I think there was a kind of credibility that went with having three networks. There was a famous moment in 1968 where Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam, and he came back and he gave a very sober estimation of what was happening in Vietnam. Johnson watched this in the Oval Office, and at the end of it, he turned off the TV and he said, well, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And that was the point where he decided that he would not run in 1968. So one television news broadcaster was so persuasive that a president would decide not to run. I don't think that kind of authority is with any other living individual journalist at this point, but I don't know. That's really just kind of one anecdote, and that's not.
It's a good one. It's good.
Anybody else want to circle that? Okay, over here, and please tell us your name.
Hi, thank you so much for coming tonight. This has been really interesting. My name is Nina Fontanella, and I wrote my question so I wouldn't ramble. Since Watergate and further impeachments, parties have become more polarized and unity of the nation is sparse, as is reflected by the press and media. My question is, do you think parties will continue to polarize as the U.S. becomes more divided, and what would need to happen in the future to prevent polarization altogether?
All right, so question about whether the parties will continue to pull apart, whether the country is just inevitably getting more and more polarized, or can something bring us back? I hope I summarized that okay.
No, that was great.
Well, I think the obvious is it has become more polarized. I think the test will be in the coming elections to some extent. We'll see what happens in this coming election. We'll see how the people, but it has become polarized, there's no question. In terms of my experience in the House, whether you were on one side or the other, we talked to one another. We communicated. We voiced our frustrations. We talked about our families. We talked about our human life, our human condition. And that's why, when I said at the very beginning, the respect and trust in the media has gone from a high of the high 70s. It was 74% where I was, 70 to 74. And now it's in the 30s, and it's the impact. We're living in a different period, and the campaigns are conducted differently than when when I campaigned in eastern Iowa and when I ran for the legislature, as pointed out.
You know, the only thing I'll say, and that's right, Ed, is, and we all see it on these tables and charts that come up on the news about the breakdown. And the breakdown showing independence has grown and grown and grown. So the parties have a choice. There really has never, well, there was a third party once, the Bull Moose Party, but that was all because of the cult of personality with Teddy Roosevelt or something. But the truth is, we've been a two-party system, and in many ways that's led to stability. Look at a lot of the European countries where they have to cobble together, 4 or 5 different parties to even get a majority. I think it's given us a lot of stability, having two parties. But the two parties are going to have to, they're kind of at a friction point. Looking at all these independents out there, I mean, really, because that means you straddle. You're not really going with one party's views or the other. They're going to have to really get their act together and perhaps go more to the middle, both of them, maybe center-left for one, center-right, but closer to the middle in their own ways. Or you could really risk, this time it didn't work, a third party, but we've seen it the last 3 or 4 elections, or really risk having another major party really of independence that starts that way. So I think you raise a good question. I think the parties really have to have a talk with themselves. They're not doing that now, they just want to win, but hopefully they'll start.